My name is Elena Harper. I'm 31 years old, and on the afternoon that was supposed to become the happiest day of my life, more than 200 guests were driving toward a wedding that no longer existed. The chairs were gone. The flowers were gone. The string lights I had once imagined glowing above us at sunset were gone. Even the white folding arch I had paid extra for had disappeared, as if someone had erased my future with one cold, deliberate hand. All that remained was a locked gate, a cracked stretch of pavement, and the kind of silence that makes humiliation feel louder than screaming. I didn't see it at first. I was sitting in the passenger seat of Tessa's car, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that the lace of my dress had left marks on my palms. My phone kept vibrating against my thigh, one message after another, guests asking where they were supposed to park, a cousin saying the venue looked closed, Caleb's aunt texting 3 question marks in a row. Then came the photo. A wide shot of the old venue entrance, the metal chain wrapped through the gate, the paper sign hanging crooked against it like a joke, too cruel to be funny, private property, event canceled. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at someone else's disaster. Tessa took the phone from my hand before I could drop it. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. That should have told me something. Her eyes scanned the screen once, then lifted to mine in the rearview mirror. "Don't answer anyone yet," she said quietly. Quietly. As if this were not the moment my whole life had just split open. As if this were not the exact nightmare I had been trying not to name for months. My mouth went dry. "She did it," I whispered. I didn't have to say my mother's name. I didn't have to. In that moment, Lorraine Harper was everywhere. In the locked gate, in the vanished vendors, in the cold little sign, in the messages piling up from confused guests who had dressed up, hired babysitters, driven from out of town, all to arrive at an empty property and a canceled dream. My mother had always known how to wound without leaving fingerprints. She didn't throw things. She didn't slam doors. She used timing, tone, shame. She waited until the moment something mattered most, then touched the exact wire that would make everything burn. I stared through the windshield at the road ahead, but all I could see was her face when she was certain she had won. I could picture it so clearly it made my stomach turn. The navy dress, the pearls, the neat lipstick, the expression of injured dignity she wore whenever she destroyed something and wanted credit for calling it love. Somewhere, maybe just minutes away, she was probably driving toward that venue expecting to watch me collapse. She had wanted that for a long time, though I hadn't fully admitted it until 5 days earlier, when I learned she had canceled the florist, the caterer, the band, the venue, every last piece of my wedding behind my back. Not because she was confused, not because she thought she was helping, because she had decided that if this marriage could not belong to her, then it would not happen at all. My chest felt tight, but I wasn't crying. That was the strange part. I thought if my wedding ever fell apart, I would break with it. I thought I would be the woman gasping on the floor, mascara running, too devastated to stand. But what I felt sitting there in Tessa's car was colder than grief, colder than panic. It felt like the moment right after a bone snaps, when the body goes eerily still before the pain rushes in. Something inside me had stopped pleading, stopped hoping, stopped trying to make my mother into the version of herself she had never once chosen to be. Tessa reached across the console and squeezed my wrist. "Look at me," she said. I turned. Her face was calm, almost fierce. "Your guests are not going to that gate," she said. "Your mother is." For one stunned second, I just stared at her. The air in the car changed. Not softer, sharper, alive. My pulse kicked once, hard enough to hurt. Behind us, in the back seat, my bouquet of wildflowers shifted with the movement of the car, brushing against the box that held the shoes my mother had called cheap, the veil she had mocked, the life she had spent months trying to crush before it could become mine. And that was the moment I understood. My mother believed she had canceled my wedding. She had no idea she was the only one still headed to the ruins. My name is Elena Harper. I'm 31 years old, and on the afternoon that was supposed to become the happiest day of my life, 230 guests were driving toward a wedding that no longer existed. The chairs were gone. The flowers were gone. The string lights I had once imagined glowing above us at sunset were gone. Even the white folding arch I had paid extra for had disappeared, as if someone had erased my future with one cold, deliberate hand. All that remained was a locked gate, a cracked stretch of pavement, and the kind of silence that makes humiliation feel louder than screaming. I didn't see it at first. Tessa and I were already on our way to the real ceremony site when my phone began vibrating so hard against my thigh it felt like a second pulse. One message after another. Guests asking where they were supposed to park. A cousin saying the old venue looked closed. Caleb's aunt texting 3 question marks in a row. Then came the photo. A wide shot of the original entrance, a metal chain wrapped through the gate, a paper sign hanging crooked against it like a joke too cruel to be funny. Private property. Event cancelled. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at someone else's disaster. Tessa took the phone from my hand before I could drop it. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. That should have told me something. Her eyes moved over the screen once, then lifted to mine in the rearview mirror. "Don't answer anyone yet," she said quietly. Quietly, as if this were not the moment my whole life had just split open. My mouth went dry. "She did it," I whispered. I didn't have to say my mother's name. I could feel Lorraine Harper in that image as clearly as if she were standing beside the locked gate herself. My mother had always known how to hurt people without ever raising her voice. She used timing, tone, shame. She waited until the exact moment something mattered most, then touched the one place she knew would make everything collapse. I stared through the windshield at the road ahead, but all I could see was her face when she believed she had won. I could picture it so clearly it made my stomach turn. The navy dress, the pearls, the lipstick put on with the care of a woman expecting an audience. Somewhere, maybe only minutes away, she was probably driving toward that venue expecting to watch me fall apart. She had wanted that for longer than I had been willing to admit. 5 days earlier, I had learned she had canceled the florist, the caterer, the band, the venue, every last piece of my wedding behind my back. Not because she was confused, not because she thought she was helping, because she had decided that if this marriage could not belong to her, then it would not happen at all. My chest felt tight, but I wasn't crying. That was the strange part. I had always imagined that if my wedding day ever shattered, I would shatter with it. I thought I would be the woman gasping on the floor, mascara running, too devastated to stand. But what I felt sitting there in Tessa's car was colder than grief, colder than panic. It felt like the second after a bone snaps, when the body goes eerily still before the pain arrives. Something inside me had stopped begging, stopped hoping, stopped trying to turn my mother into a version of herself she had never once chosen to be. Tessa reached across the console and wrapped her hand around my wrist. "Look at me," she said. I turned. Her face was calm, but there was steel under it. "Your guests are not going to that gate," she said. "Your mother is." For one stunned second, I just stared at her. The air inside the car changed. Not softer, sharper, alive. My pulse kicked once, hard enough to hurt. Behind us, in the back seat, my bouquet of wildflowers shifted with the curve of the road, brushing against the box that held the shoes my mother had called cheap, the veil she had mocked, the life she had spent months trying to crush before it could become mine. And that was the moment I understood. My mother believed she had canceled my wedding. She had no idea she was the only one still headed to the ruins. Back then, though, I still believed the ruin was preventable. In the first few weeks after our engagement, my mother moved with such polished restraint that, from the outside, it could almost pass for love. Lorraine Harper did not burst into a room and snatch control in one dramatic scene. She preferred something quieter, cleaner, harder to accuse. She offered help. She made suggestions. She volunteered to lighten the load. And by the time you realized your choices were no longer yours, she was already standing in the middle of them, smiling as if she had been invited there from the beginning. At first, I let myself believe that was all it was. Help. I was working long shifts at Street Ann's Medical Center, sometimes leaving before sunrise and coming home with aching feet and the kind of exhaustion that made small decisions feel enormous. Caleb was overloaded too, finishing a walnut dining table for a client in Madison while sketching ideas for the built-in shelves he wanted to make for the den after we got married. So when my mother called one evening and said, "You two are clearly overwhelmed. Let me at least make a few vendor calls," I heard kindness in her voice because I wanted to. Because wanting peace has a way of disguising danger. "Just a few," I told her, standing in our kitchen with a carton of takeout in one hand. "We still want to choose everything ourselves." "Of course you do," she said warmly. "I'm your mother, Elena, not a tyrant." I remember smiling at that. The first unmistakable sign came with the flowers. One Sunday afternoon, Tessa and I spread magazine clippings, color swatches, and florist samples all over the dining table. I wanted wild arrangements that looked soft and alive, pale yellow ranunculus, blue delphinium, loose greenery, something that felt joyful instead of stiff. I wanted the wedding to feel like us. Warm, real, a little imperfect in the best way. We spent hours building that vision, and for the first time since the engagement, I felt excited instead of managed. 2 days later, the florist emailed the revised sample invoice. Every note we had discussed was gone. In place of the wildflowers were white orchids, ivory roses, silver ribbon, crystal stands, elegant, expensive, cold. I read the email twice, thinking there had to be some kind of mistake, then called the shop. "Oh," the florist said pleasantly, "your mother approved the updated design yesterday." She said the original choices felt a little too rustic. My grip tightened around the phone. "She what?" "She said you'd changed your mind and wanted something more formal." I hung up and called my mother right away. "Why did you change my flowers?" She laughed softly, like I was being overdramatic over nothing. "Because you're getting married, Elena, not decorating a barn dance." I liked the wildflowers. "You like plenty of things that don't photograph well." That was my mother's particular talent. She could make your happiness sound juvenile in a single sentence. Not loudly, not cruelly enough for witnesses to call it cruelty. Just enough to make you question your own taste, your own judgment, your own right to want what you wanted. I should have stopped it there. I know that now. But resistance still felt wrong to me then. Almost disloyal. Our family had been through years of loss, and my mother knew exactly how to drape that grief over every disagreement until it felt impossible to pull away without looking heartless. So, instead of fighting, I adjusted. Then I adjusted again. I wanted smoked brisket sliders, cornbread, and bourbon-glazed carrots for the reception dinner, something warm and southern and familiar. My mother replaced it with filet medallions, asparagus bundles, and a plated mushroom course that sounded like it had been designed for strangers. I wanted acoustic music under amber string lights. Come to date her. She started meeting with a violin trio called the Everly Ensemble and told me they were far more appropriate. I wanted Caleb's family in the first 2 rows because they were loud and affectionate and had embraced me, before they even knew me well. She redrew the seating chart so her country club friends would be closest to the aisle. Every decision became a quiet theft, and every time I tried to object, she wrapped control in prettier language. She was protecting me from mistakes. She was helping me avoid embarrassment. She was making sure the day looked worthy of the occasion. She never said the real thing out loud, that she could not bear the thought of my life taking shape beyond her reach. Caleb noticed long before I admitted anything was wrong. One night he came in from the garage, wiping stain from his hands with an old rag, and found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at 3 revised catering menus my mother had sent without asking. He stood behind me for a moment, reading over my shoulder, then set the rag down beside my elbow. "Did you choose any of this?" he asked. I looked at the pages again, at all the polished little changes that had somehow erased me piece by piece. I should have said no. I should have said, "She's taking over everything, and I don't know how to stop her." Instead, I gave the answer I had been trained to give for most of my life. "She's only trying to help." Caleb went still. Not angry, just quiet in that deliberate way he had when he was choosing not to push harder than I could bear. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, his forearms resting on his knees. "Elena," he said gently, "at what point does help stop feeling like help?" I didn't answer. Because underneath the invoices and flower swaps and rewritten seating charts, I already knew. I knew it in the tightness in my chest every time my phone lit up with her name. I knew it in the way my own wedding had started to feel like an event I was being briefed on instead of a life I was building. This was no longer my wedding. It was my mother's performance, and I was being dressed for the part. It was my mother's performance, and I was being dressed for the part. The first time she tried to come between Caleb and me, she did it with such polished precision that, for a few hours afterward, I almost managed to convince myself I was overreacting. That was her gift. Lorraine Harper never needed shouting to do damage. She preferred quieter weapons, a private lunch, a lowered voice, a sentence placed so carefully it could keep bleeding long after the conversation ended. It happened about 2 months after our engagement. Once the flowers had been changed, the menu had been rewritten, and I had already started telling myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as being mature. My mother called one Tuesday morning and said she wanted to take Caleb to lunch. Just the two of them. "He's going to be my son-in-law," she said lightly. "Surely I'm allowed to know the man my daughter is marrying." I should have heard the trap in that. Instead, I heard hope. By then, I was tired. Tired of the tension every time her name lit up on my phone. Tired of the way Caleb went quiet whenever a wedding decision somehow stopped sounding like mine. Tired of feeling caught between the man I loved and the woman who had taught me, my whole life, that disappointing her was a kind of betrayal. So when she suggested Bellamy's, a little Italian place downtown with white tablecloths and framed vineyard prints on the walls, I let myself think maybe she was trying. Maybe she had finally decided to make room for him. Caleb came home a little after 3 that afternoon. I still remember the sound of his truck in the driveway, then the soft thud of the front door closing behind him. I was in the kitchen, rinsing strawberries for dinner, the late light slanting across the counter, turning the water in the sink gold. He stepped inside, set his keys down carefully, and for a second just stood there. That was when I knew something had happened. Caleb was not a man who carried tension dramatically. If he was quiet, it meant the silence mattered. "How was lunch?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He pulled out the chair across from the table and sat down, his shoulders still squared inside his work shirt, one hand resting flat against the wood as if grounding himself before he spoke. There was no suspicion in his face, no accusation. That made it worse somehow. If he had looked angry, I would have known where to put my fear. Instead, he looked thoughtful, careful, like a man stepping around broken glass. "Elena," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I'd rather hear it from you than from anyone else." The water kept running over the strawberries even after my hands stopped moving. "Okay," I said. He held my eyes. "Did you go through some kind of breakdown a few years ago?" The room didn't explode. It narrowed. There had been a season in my life when grief had flattened me. After everything my family had lost, I had spent months moving through my days like someone underwater. I saw a therapist. I took leave. I struggled. Then I did the harder thing. I got better. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't hers to hand out like a warning label either. I turned off the faucet. "What did she say?" Caleb exhaled once, slow and controlled. "She said you were fragile, that stress makes you spiral, that you've never fully been stable since your family losses." His jaw tightened. Just once. Then she told me I needed to understand what I was marrying. The strawberries sat in the colander between us, dripping red onto the steel sink. I felt the heat rise in my face, then disappear so fast it left me cold. Did she call me damaged goods? His eyes sharpened. Yes. I looked down at the counter and let out one short, bitter laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so exactly her. She had always known how to take the most vulnerable part of someone's life and hold it up as proof they were unworthy. Pain, to my mother, was never something to be cared for. It was leverage. "What did you say?" I asked. Caleb didn't even pause. "I told her I wasn't marrying your worst year." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Something in me loosened so suddenly, it almost hurt. Not because he had defended me, though he had, because he had seen the ugliest version of the story and refused to mistake it for the truth. He leaned back slightly, his voice still calm. "I told her getting help after being knocked flat doesn't make you broken. It makes you honest. And I told her if she thought one conversation was going to make me doubt you, then she didn't know either of us very well." I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the counter. "She was trying to protect me," he added, and now there was finally the smallest trace of disbelief in his voice. At least that's what she called it. "No," I thought. Protection was what people offered when they wanted you safe. This was something else entirely. "Elena," Caleb said quietly, "that wasn't a hard conversation with an overbearing mother. That was a warning shot." I looked at him, and in his face, for the first time, I saw that he understood the scale of it. Part 3 had been about control, about flowers and food and seating charts, and all the ways my mother could reach into a wedding and make it hers. But this was different. This was not about centerpieces or aesthetics or appearances. This was about isolation. about poisoning the ground beneath my feet so thoroughly that I would have nowhere to stand except beside her. The kitchen felt very still then. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere beyond the window, a lawnmower started up and faded again. Ordinary sounds, ordinary afternoon. And right in the middle of it, the shape of the truth settled into place so clearly I could no longer pretend not to see it. My mother was not just trying to control my wedding. She was trying to make sure I never got to leave her at all. My mother was not just trying to control my wedding. She was trying to make sure I never got to leave her at all. I wish I could say that realization changed me overnight. That the second I finally saw the truth clearly, I stood up straighter, found some hidden reserve of courage, and stopped letting her into every corner of my life. But clarity and action are not born at the same speed. Sometimes the mind understands long before the body stops flinching. For the next several days, I moved through my life as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. I went to work at Street. Ann's, checked charts, answered call lights, smiled at patients, and came home with that same hard truth sitting under my ribs like a stone I could not swallow. My mother's words no longer sounded merely controlling to me. They sounded calculated. Every softened phrase carried pressure under it. Every sigh had purpose. Every act of help now looked like what it really was. A hand reaching deeper into a life that was supposed to be mine. Tessa noticed before I said much of anything. She showed up on Thursday night with takeout containers balanced in one arm and a bottle of grocery store Pinot Noir tucked against her hip. She kicked off her shoes by the door, walked into the living room, and stopped. I was sitting on the floor in front of the coffee table with vendor printouts scattered around me, my laptop open, 3 tabs glowing on the screen, and the kind of stillness that only happens when someone is trying very hard not to panic. From the back of the house, I could hear Caleb in the garage finishing a piece for a client, the low hum of a sander drifting in and out through the mudroom. Tessa set the food down slowly. "Okay," she said. "What did she do now?" Not what happened. What did she do now? That was Tessa. She had never fully bought my mother's performance, not even in the early days when I still kept trying to explain it away. She had seen Lorraine in small doses over the years and somehow recognized, long before I did, that there was always a cost hidden inside the kindness. I looked at her, and whatever little bit of energy I had left for pretending disappeared. So I told her. The lunch with Caleb, the word fragile, the phrase damaged goods, the way my mother had handed him the worst chapter of my life, as if she were attaching a warning tag to a defective product. I told her how calmly he had repeated it back to me, and how hearing it out loud had made something in me go cold. Tessa didn't interrupt. She sat down across from me, elbows on her knees, and listened all the way through. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and let out one slow breath through her nose. "I knew she was getting bolder," she said. "I didn't know she'd moved this fast." I looked up. "You knew?" She gave me a look that was more sad than sharp. "Elena, the day she changed your florist contact without asking, I knew this wasn't normal. The day she rewrote your seating chart around her friends, I knew it was worse than meddling. This?" She nodded toward me. "This is escalation." The word hit harder coming from her. I stared down at the vendor sheets spread across the rug. Revised quotes, updated menus, notes in my mother's tone disguised as planning details. "I keep thinking maybe I should have stopped this earlier." "Maybe," Tessa said gently, "but that's not the useful question anymore." I looked at her. The useful question is how much access she still has. She reached for the stack of papers and began sorting through them with quick, practical movements. Which vendors have her as a contact? Does she have copies of contracts? Does she have the full guest list? Addresses? Phone numbers? I blinked. "Some of them, yes." "How many is some?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Too many." Tessa nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. There was no surprise in her face now, only focus. "Okay." Then we stopped guessing. From the garage, the sander cut off. A few seconds later, Caleb came in through the mudroom, forearms dusted with sawdust, safety glasses pushed up into his hair. He took one look at the room, the papers, my face, Tessa's expression, and understood immediately that this was no longer a normal Thursday night. "What do you need?" he asked. Tessa glanced at him, then back at me. "Right now, I need both of you to act like nothing has changed." I frowned. Why? Because your mother still thinks she's the smartest person in the room, Tessa said. And people like that get careless when they feel safe. She stacked the vendor printouts neatly, then met my eyes. Back up every contract, every deposit, every contact list, every email. Don't confront her yet. Don't shut her out yet. Let her keep thinking she's ahead. Caleb moved behind me and rested his hand lightly on my shoulder. Steady, warm, certain. Tessa stood, took the unopened bottle of wine off the table, and set it in the kitchen as if dinner had become irrelevant. Then she turned back to me. Trust me, she said. And for now, don't ask what I'm thinking. Just do exactly what I tell you. At the time, I thought she meant spreadsheets, passwords, and backup folders. I didn't know yet that Tessa had already started preparing for something much bigger. At the time, all I understood was that something in me had changed, and once that change happens, even the oldest lies stop fitting the way they used to. I still answered my mother's calls. I still let her talk. I still said things like, "We'll think about it, and that sounds nice, and I'll ask Caleb." But I was no longer hearing her with the ears she had trained. I was hearing her with distance for the first time, and distance is cruel to illusion. So I did exactly what Tessa told me to do. Late at night, after my shifts at Street Ann's, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open and started backing up everything my mother had touched. Contracts, deposit receipts, vendor emails, contact lists, revised invoices, notes she had inserted into planning threads as if she were a co-bride instead of a mother who could not let go. Caleb sat across from me most nights, going line by line through paperwork with the kind of patience that made me want to cry more than comfort ever did. He never said, "I told you so." He never rushed me. He just helped me build a version of the truth that could not be edited once it was finally needed. On the surface, though, nothing changed. My mother still called as if she were guiding me toward a perfect day instead of slowly swallowing it. She still used that same careful voice, the one that always sounded composed enough to make me seem unreasonable by comparison. She asked whether I had reconsidered the ceremony music. She reminded me that certain flowers wilted badly in photographs. She wondered aloud if Caleb's family would feel out of place in such a formal setting, then immediately insisted she was only thinking of everyone's comfort. Before, I would have heard concern in those comments. Now I heard something cleaner and colder. Every question narrowed my options. Every suggestion carried a correction inside it. She was not helping me plan a wedding. She was teaching me, over and over, that I could not be trusted to manage my own life without her hand on the wheel. A few evenings later, after one of those calls, I took my dinner plate out to the back porch and never touched it. The food sat in my lap going cold, while the air hung heavy with that summer smell of damp grass and coming rain. The yard behind the house was quiet except for cicadas and the occasional flash of fireflies near the fence. I was still in my scrubs, my hair half fallen out of its clip, my body exhausted and my mind too awake. Caleb came outside a few minutes later. He must have seen the plate still full through the kitchen window. He sat down beside me on the porch step without asking questions right away. That was his way. He never rushed straight at pain. He let it come toward him on its own. After a minute, he looked out into the yard and said, "She called again." It wasn't a question. I let out a breath and stared at the dark line of the fence. "She wanted to know if we'd finalized the ceremony music," I said. Then she explained why the song I picked sounded too casual. Then she started crying because I seemed distant. Caleb nodded once, like the sequence made perfect sense. To him, maybe it did. I picked at the edge of the paper napkin under my plate. "I hate that she can still do this to me," I said quietly. "One phone call and I feel like I'm 13 again, like I'm already in trouble and I don't even know for what." He turned his head then and looked at me fully. "That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, Elena." "Then what does it mean?" "It means she's had a lifetime of practice." That settled over me hard because it was simple, and simple things are sometimes the hardest to escape. I had spent years searching for noble explanations for my mother's behavior: grief, loneliness, fear, stress. I had turned her into a complicated tragedy because that was easier than admitting something much more ordinary and much more painful. She liked control, and she was very good at getting it. I stared down at the untouched food in my lap. Tessa thinks she's escalating. She is. There it was again, that certainty. Not dramatic, not angry, just plain. Caleb had a way of saying the truest thing in the room without dressing it up. I shook my head, still fighting the last reflexes of the old loyalty. She says she's trying to protect me. No, he said, and this time there was no pause at all. She says that because protection sounds loving, but protecting you would mean helping you stand on your own. He kept his eyes on mine. What she's doing is making every choice feel dangerous unless it goes through her first. I went still. He wasn't talking only about the wedding anymore. I could hear that. He was talking about college applications, apartments, jobs, boyfriends. Every time in my life my mother had stepped in just far enough to make me doubt myself, then called it support when I leaned back on her. The wedding was not some sudden break from the past. It was the same story with higher stakes and nicer flowers. She needs me to stay on shore, I said, and even to me the sentence sounded new. Caleb's expression softened, but he didn't look away. Yes, not because he wanted to hurt me, because he wanted me to hear myself say it. The porch felt smaller after that, as if the truth had taken up physical space between us. Inside the house, the dishwasher kicked on with a low mechanical hum. A car rolled past out front. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and fell silent again. Everything around me sounded normal, which only made the moment feel sharper. For the first time, I understood that my mother was no longer confusing to me. She was predictable. And somehow, that frightened me even more. Because once someone becomes predictable, you start noticing the pattern everywhere. Not just in the things they say to your face, but in the silence that follows, in the calls they make when you are not in the room, in the way the world around you begins to tilt without any obvious hand touching it. The first sign that my mother had moved beyond private sabotage and into something larger came on a Saturday morning at Nora's hair studio, a place on Maple Avenue where women from 3 different neighborhoods got their color done, exchanged casserole recipes, and passed information back and forth like it was part of the service. I had gone in for a trim before my shift, still half asleep, coffee in hand, expecting nothing more dramatic than split ends and small talk. Nora draped the cape around my shoulders, caught my eyes in the mirror, and hesitated. That hesitation was what made my stomach drop. "What?" I asked. She gave a quick little shake of her head, then lowered her voice. "Honey, are you okay?" The question hit me with the soft force of something rehearsed. Why wouldn't I be? Nora's scissors paused over my shoulder. "Your mother stopped by yesterday. She said you'd been under a lot of strain, that the wedding might be getting to you." Another pause. She seemed concerned. Concerned. There was that word again, polished and lethal. I stared at my reflection, at my own face going still beneath the fluorescent lights. What exactly did she say? Nora looked embarrassed now, like she regretted even opening the door. "Just that you'd had a hard time in the past, and she was worried you were pushing yourself too far, that maybe people should be gentle with you right now." Gentle. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, very evenly, "I'm fine, Nora." She nodded too quickly, relieved to let me have the lie if I wanted it, but the damage was already done. My mother had started laying groundwork, not dramatic enough to be called slander. Just careful little seeds planted in enough places that by the time they bloomed, everyone would think the story had grown there naturally. The next hint came less than 24 hours later. I was at Miller's Market picking up milk, lemons, and one of the frozen lasagnas Caleb liked after long work days when Mrs. Hanley at the register gave me a look I had never seen from her before in my life. Pity. Real pity. Softened around the edges like she believed I might break if she handled me too roughly. "Sweetheart," she said as she handed me my receipt, "don't let anybody rush you into something you're not ready for." My fingers tightened around the plastic bag. "I'm sorry?" She smiled the sad smile people use when they believe they know something terrible about you. "Nothing. Just take care of yourself." By the time I got to the parking lot, my hands were shaking. I sat in my car with the groceries on the passenger seat and understood, finally, that this was no longer just about Caleb, or flowers, or menus. My mother was widening the circle. She was making me into a story the town could tell itself. Fragile, overwhelmed, not quite stable enough to trust her own choices. And in a town like ours, once enough people start hearing the same version, truth stops mattering. Familiarity takes its place. That evening I told Caleb what Nora had said, then what Mrs. Hanley had implied. He stood at the kitchen counter listening, one hand braced against the edge, his face getting quieter with every sentence. "She's poisoning the room before we even walk into it," he said. I nodded. "And she's doing it so carefully that if I confront her, I sound paranoid." That was the genius of it. My mother never shoved. She nudged. She cried. She implied. She let other people finish the ugliness for her. On Tuesday, 5 days before the wedding, the bottom fell out. I was on my lunch break at Street Ann's, sitting in the break room with a yogurt I hadn't opened, when I decided to call Meadow and Pine Florals just to confirm delivery times. I almost didn't. It was one of those small, practical instincts that arrive without fanfare, and if I had ignored it, I think everything would have shattered differently. The florist picked up on the second ring. "Meadow and Pine, this is Callie." "Hi, Callie. It's Elena Harper." "I just wanted to confirm Saturday's wedding order." There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough for my skin to go cold. "Oh," she said. "Miss Harper, that order was canceled on Friday." My mouth went dry. "What?" "I'm sorry. We spoke to your mother. She said the ceremony was off and that all floral services needed to be terminated immediately." I stood up so fast my chair scraped backward across the tile. "No," I said. "No, I didn't cancel anything." Callie's voice changed instantly, the brightness draining out of it. "I'm sorry. She said she was calling on your behalf." I hung up and called the caterer. Cancelled. Then the live band. Cancelled. Then the venue. Cancelled. Each call landed like another floor dropping away beneath me. By the fourth one, I was no longer hearing full sentences, just fragments. "Friday. Your mother. On your behalf. Ceremony was off. We thought you knew." I walked out of the break room and into the empty hallway by radiology because it was the only place nearby without people. My phone was still in my hand. My reflection in the darkened window looked like a woman I didn't quite recognize. 5 days before my wedding, my mother had not just crossed a line. She had finally stepped over it so openly that even she could no longer pretend it was love. I don't remember much about the drive home from Street Ann's. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt. I remember stopping at a red light and realizing I had no idea how long it had been red. Mostly, I remember the feeling of something inside me going strangely still. Not calm, not acceptance. Just that numb, suspended silence that comes when the body understands disaster a few seconds before the mind can name it. By the time I got home, Caleb was already there. He must have left the workshop the second he got my text, because when I came through the back door, he was standing in the kitchen with his keys still in one hand and sawdust along the sleeve of his work shirt. He took one look at me and crossed the room without asking questions. His hands closed gently around my arms, grounding me before my knees had a chance to give out. "She canceled everything," I said. The words came out flat, too flat, like they belonged to someone else. "The florist, the caterer, the band, the venue." I swallowed and tried again. "She called them on Friday. Told them the wedding was off. They thought it was me, or that she was speaking for me." Caleb's jaw tightened once, but his voice stayed level. "Okay." That one word should have irritated me. It didn't. It was the only thing in the room that didn't sound like panic. I shook my head hard. 5 days, Caleb. We have 5 days, and she took all of it." He kept his eyes on me. "Then we work from what's left." A broken laugh escaped me. "What's left?" Instead of answering, he reached for his phone and called Tessa. She picked up almost immediately. Caleb gave her the short version. Vendor cancellations confirmed. Lorraine behind it. 5 days until the wedding. I watched his face while he listened, and what struck me most was that he did not look surprised by her response. Focused, yes. Alarmed, yes, but not surprised. After a few seconds, he said, "Okay, we won't call anybody yet." I stared at him the moment he lowered the phone. "What do you mean we won't call anybody yet?" "Tessa says don't contact the vendors for the next 48 hours unless she tells us to." My whole body recoiled. 48 hours? Caleb, are you serious? "She needs the next 48 hours clear." "For what?" My voice cracked on the last word. What could possibly matter more right now than fixing my wedding? Before he could answer, there was a knock at the back door. 2 quick taps. Calm. Certain. Caleb opened it, and Tessa stepped in carrying a thick manila folder pressed against her side. She didn't look rushed. That was the first thing I noticed. Not casual, not relaxed, but prepared. as if she had been moving toward this exact moment for a long time and had simply hoped she would never need to arrive. She set the folder on the kitchen table and looked at me. "I need you to let me finish before you say anything." My throat tightened. "Tessa." All the way through, Elena. Something in her voice made me stop. She opened the folder. Inside were printed contracts, deposit receipts, a handwritten contact sheet, and a glossy brochure for a property just outside town. She slid that brochure toward me first. At the top, in dark green lettering, were the words Rosewood Orchard. I frowned down at it. Apple trees, ceremony garden, reception lawn with string lights, private events by reservation. "What is this?" I asked. Tessa folded her hands on the table. "Your backup venue." I looked up at her. Sure, I had heard wrong. "My what?" "Your backup venue," she repeated. "For the wedding." For a second, I couldn't make sense of the sentence. Backup venue. Wedding. As if those words had always belonged together, and I was the only one hearing it too late. "Tessa," I said slowly. "What are you talking about?" She held my gaze. "The day your mother changed your florist contact without asking, I called someone I know who helps manage private events out at Rosewood. The owner is an old client of my cousin's. They don't do standard long-term holds, but they do flexible seasonal reservations if the date stays open and the deposit is current." She tapped one of the receipts in the folder. "So I kept it current, quietly, month by month." The kitchen went completely silent. I stared at her. "You reserved a whole second venue?" "Yes." "How long ago?" 6.5 months. The number hit me so hard I had to grip the back of a chair. Tessa's expression softened, just slightly. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't trying to scare you before I had to. And I didn't want your mother catching even the shadow of a backup plan if this ever turned ugly." She paused. I was waiting to see how far she'd go. I heard Caleb exhale beside me, slow and stunned. "You thought she might actually do this," I said. "I thought she might do something," Tessa corrected. Then she kept getting bolder, and I stopped believing in luck. She slid another paper toward me. Not a full vendor lineup, just a short list with 3 names highlighted. "These are the first calls I'm making," she said. "But not until I know exactly what needs replacing, and in what order. That's why I told Caleb I need the next 48 hours. Not to wait, to move." Something shifted in my chest then. Not relief, not yet. Relief was too soft a word for it. This felt sharper, like hope arriving with work boots on. I looked down at the folder again. At the deposit receipt with Tessa's name on it. At the orchard brochure. At the evidence that while my mother had been planning how to destroy my wedding, my best friend had been quietly building a second version of it where Lorraine could not reach. "You did all this for me?" I whispered. Tessa didn't smile. "No," she said. "I did it because your mother was never going to be the only one making plans." Then she pulled the rest of the papers closer, straightened the stack, and looked at both of us with the kind of steady focus that makes panic feel almost childish. "And this," she said, "is just the first piece." For the first time that day, everything stopped feeling like pure collapse and started feeling like structure, not safety, not relief. We were still 5 days out from a wedding my mother had gutted with a phone and a smile. But as Tessa spread papers across the kitchen table and started dividing the mess into categories, panic finally had to share the room with something more useful. A plan. She moved fast, but not chaotically. Venue papers to the left, vendor notes in the center, guest contacts on the right. Then she tore 2 sheets off a legal pad and slid one to Caleb and one to me. "We are not doing this emotionally tonight," she said. "Tonight we figure out what is true, what is missing, and what can still be saved." I wrapped both hands around my glass of water and nodded, even though my fingers were still trembling. Tessa tapped the Rosewood Orchard paperwork first. "This part has a deadline. I have until noon tomorrow to confirm the reservation and keep the date active. After that, the owner opens it back up." She looked directly at me. "So I need one answer now. Do you still want to get married on Saturday?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Of course I wanted to get married. I loved Caleb. I wanted the vows, the music, the people, the beginning of our actual life. But for months, so much of this wedding had stopped belonging to me that hearing someone ask what I wanted felt almost unfamiliar. My mother had trained me to respond to pressure, not desire, to react, not choose. I looked at Caleb, then back at Tessa. Yes, I said. I still want it. Tessa nodded once. Good. Then from this point forward, nothing gets planned around Lorraine. That sentence changed the air in the room. Caleb picked up the venue brochure and scanned it again. Capacity? 240 if we use the ceremony garden and the main lawn together, Tessa said. Your original count fits with room to spare. I stared at her. You already checked all that? I checked all of it, she said simply. There was no drama in her voice, no need to be praised for it. That made it hit even harder. She hadn't made a backup out of adrenaline. She had built it carefully, months ago, because she loved me enough to prepare for the worst version of my mother before I was ready to admit that version existed. Then she slid a short list toward Caleb. 3 names, 1 florist, 1 caterer, 1 rental company. These are my first calls at 8 tomorrow morning, she said. Not because they're the only options, but because they're the fastest, the cleanest, and least likely to repeat anything they hear. I glanced down at the page. That's all? For tonight, yes, Tessa said. I'm not opening 10 doors at once when we only need 3. We move in order. Venue locked first, core vendors second, guests last. The way she said it made my own fear feel messy, almost childish. Not wrong, just unhelpful. What about everyone we invited? I asked. Tessa pulled out the contact sheet she had copied months ago. Every line was handwritten in her block print, neat and deliberate. I kept the original guest list before your mother got her hands on it. Phone numbers, emails, family groupings, all of it. Once I confirm Rosewood and the first replacement vendors, I'll draft a single message and then break out the key guests for direct calls. Caleb frowned. When do they get told? The morning of the wedding. I looked up sharply. That late? Yes, she said, because if Lorraine gets even 6 extra hours, she'll use them. She'll call people, cry, lie, show up somewhere, start a new story. The shorter the window, the less damage she can do. I should have flinched hearing my mother spoken about like a threat that had to be contained. Instead, I felt relief. Not because it was cruel, because it was precise. For a moment, nobody spoke. The house was quiet except for the soft tick of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of paper as Tessa reordered the stacks. Then she looked at me again, and her voice changed. Not softer, sharper. There's one more rule, she said. I already knew I wasn't going to like it. What? You do not confront your mother tomorrow, or the next day. No calls, no texts, no emotional speeches, nothing. My body went rigid. Tessa, I mean it, Elena. She didn't raise her voice, but there was no room in it. Right now, Lorraine thinks she already won. That is the only reason we still have an advantage. The second she feels you pulling away, she will escalate faster. Caleb set his pen down. She's right. I looked from one of them to the other, anger rising fast and hot. So I'm supposed to just sit there while she destroys my wedding? No, Tessa said. You're supposed to do the hardest thing possible. You're supposed to stay silent long enough for us to move around her. That landed differently. All my life, silence with my mother had meant surrender. It meant swallowing what I really felt so she could keep the upper hand. But this was not that kind of silence. This was not fear. It was control. For once, silence would not protect her. It would protect me. What if she calls? I asked. She will, Tessa said. What if she comes here? Caleb answered before Tessa could. Then I handle the door. I turned and looked at him. He said it calmly, like a fact already decided, and for the first time in months, that calm didn't feel passive. It felt like a wall being built where there had never been one before. Tessa pulled one sheet out from the stack and slid it across the table toward me. At the top, in thick black ink, she had written, Things Lorraine cannot know. Under it were 3 lines. New venue. Replacement vendors. Guest notification plan. I stared at the words for a long moment. Then I nodded. My mother had spent months teaching me that every major step in my life had to pass through her first. That night, for the first time, I chose silence not because I was afraid of her, but because I was preparing to leave her outside the story entirely. Thursday night bled into Friday in a blur of restraint. I did exactly what Tessa told me to do. I did not call my mother. I did not answer when she called me Friday morning. I listened to one voicemail by mistake and heard that familiar trembling, injured tone she always used when she wanted to sound wounded before anyone else had the chance to tell the truth. I deleted it halfway through. Then I went to work, smiled when I had to, charted patient notes, and moved through my shift with that hard, deliberate silence sitting inside me like a locked door. By Friday afternoon, the plan was no longer an idea. It was moving. Rosewood Orchard was confirmed before noon. Tessa's first replacement calls had worked. The florist she trusted could do a smaller, faster version of what we needed if we kept the arrangements loose and seasonal. The caterer agreed to simplify the menu and still make it beautiful. The rental company had chairs, linens, and enough table settings to cover the guest count, even if none of it matched the polished version my mother had forced on me before she tried to destroy everything. Strangely, that no longer felt like a loss. The wedding was starting to look like mine again. My mother, meanwhile, still believed she had ended it, and because she believed that, she got sloppy. Friday evening, I was at Tessa's house folding napkins at her dining table when my phone lit up with a screenshot from one of my coworkers at Street Ann's. It was a Facebook post from my mother's account. "Please pray for my daughter. She is making choices in a fragile state, and as her mother, I have done everything I can. Sometimes love means stepping back and letting hard lessons happen." I read it once, then a second time, my face burning hotter with every word. Fragile state. There it was again. The same poison, just dressed up for a bigger audience. Tessa took the phone from my hand before I could respond. "No," she said. She posted it publicly. "I know. She's telling people I'm unstable." "I know." Her voice stayed level, and that steadiness was the only reason mine didn't break apart. She locked my phone and set it face down on the table. "Let her post," she said. "By tomorrow night, people are going to have something else to look at." That night I slept in Tessa's guest room, or tried to. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the fan turned overhead and the dark pressed softly against the windows. Somewhere in town, my mother probably believed I was humiliated, cornered, broken down enough to come crawling back to her version of safety. The thought did not crush me the way it would have a month earlier. It only made me colder, sharper, ready. By Saturday morning, I was still tense, still wired, but I was no longer willing to let fear make decisions for me. At 6:30, Tessa was already up with coffee in one hand and the guest list in the other, moving through her plan with clipped, practical focus. She had color-coded everything overnight. Close family and essential guests first. Then the people most likely to answer quickly and help spread correct information without adding drama. By 9 a.m., Caleb's mother, his cousins, my nursing school friends, and nearly everyone who mattered had the updated location. The message was simple. "Venue update for Elena and Caleb's wedding. Please arrive at Rosewood Orchard by 3:30 p.m. and do not go to the original location." No explanation, no apology, no room for confusion. One person did not get that message. My mother. By 2:30 that afternoon, Rosewood looked like the wedding I had wanted before Lorraine ever got her hands on it. The orchard air smelled like cut grass and late apples. Light moved through the trees in long golden strips. The flowers were softer than the ones my mother had chosen, and somehow more beautiful because of it. Cream blooms tucked into wild greenery, pale blue delphinium, arrangements that looked alive instead of staged. Guests started arriving in a steady stream, and with each car that pulled in, the knot in my chest loosened a little more. Caleb's mother hugged me so tightly I nearly cried. My friend Dana from nursing school stepped onto the lawn, looked around once and whispered, "This feels like you." At 3:15, Caleb and I were standing near the ceremony garden under the old iron arbor when Tessa's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, read something, then lifted her eyes to mine. "What is it?" I asked. "Your mother's at the original venue." My heart kicked once, hard and painful. I could see it instantly. Lorraine in one of her expensive dresses, pearls at her throat, stepping out of her car expecting chaos, expecting confusion, tears, humiliation, maybe even the final surrender she had been trying to force out of me for months, expecting to stand in the middle of the ruin she had made and be needed for what came after. Instead, she found an empty property, a locked gate, no guests, no music, no florist vans, no ceremony. Just heat rising off the pavement and the slow, unbearable realization that the wedding had not died with her plan. Tessa's phone buzzed again. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she read the second message. "Someone answered her call," she said. "Looks like Aunt Bev gave her the new address." Of course it would be something like that. Not a brilliant deduction, not a dramatic discovery. Just one older relative, confused and trying to be helpful, accidentally handing my mother the last piece she needed. Tessa looked back up at me. She's on her way. And just like that, the white gate at Rosewood stopped being decorative. It became a line. By the time my mother's car turned onto the gravel drive at Rosewood Orchard, the music had already started and the guests were seated, but I had not yet taken my first step down the aisle. The guitarist was playing softly beneath the trees, the late afternoon light stretched gold across the lawn, and for one suspended moment, everything felt balanced on the edge of becoming real. Caleb was waiting beneath the arbor. I stood at the start of the aisle with my bouquet in both hands, breathing carefully, trying to hold on to the strange calm I had fought so hard to earn. Then Tessa moved to my side and leaned in just enough for only me to hear her. "She's here." I did not turn around. That was the first thing that told me I was no longer the woman my mother thought she owned. A month earlier, even hearing those words would have sent panic through my body so fast I might have dropped the bouquet. I would have worried about her scene, her feelings, her outrage, her ability to ruin the moment before it began. But standing there in the orchard, with 230 people gathered for a wedding she had tried to erase, something inside me held. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, but firmly. "Can she get in?" I asked. Tessa's eyes flicked toward the gate, then back to me. "Not unless someone makes that happen." That answer steadied me more than comfort would have. Rosewood had one narrow entrance from the gravel lane, a white wooden gate framed by low stone pillars and a small welcome table where guests had checked in as they arrived. What had looked pretty an hour earlier now felt purposeful. Caleb's cousin Ryan was standing there with the printed guest list in one hand, broad-shouldered in a dark button-down, calm in the way only useful people are calm. He worked part-time private security when construction jobs slowed down. Tessa had given him one job, and Ryan was not the kind of man who blurred instructions just because a woman in pearls raised her voice. Down the aisle, Caleb had already noticed the ripple near the back rows. A few guests had shifted in their chairs. Heads were beginning to turn. He looked toward me, and when our eyes met, he gave me the smallest nod. "Stay here." So I did. Through the gap between the last rows of chairs and the flower beds, I could see my mother getting out of her car. Navy dress, pearl earrings, her posture rigid with the outrage of someone who had arrived expecting collapse and instead found a celebration she had not been allowed to control. She stood there for half a second, taking it in the gate, the guests, the flowers, the music floating over the lawn like reality itself had insulted her. Then she started walking. Her heels pressed into the gravel as she came toward the entrance, fast enough to show anger, controlled enough to pretend she still had dignity. Ryan stepped forward before she reached him. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said evenly. "This is a private event." My mother stopped. "I'm the mother of the bride." Ryan glanced at the guest list, though he already knew what it would say. "Your name isn't on the list." Even from where I stood, I felt the impact of that sentence. Her mouth opened, then closed again. "That's impossible." "No, ma'am," Ryan said. "It isn't." A hush spread through the nearest rows. From where she stood, my mother could see everything. The arbor dressed with flowers, Caleb waiting, me in my dress. The wedding she had canceled somehow, standing there alive and untouched, just beyond a gate she could not walk through. For the first time in my life, she was on the wrong side of a boundary that her tears could not soften and her authority could not dissolve. Her voice sharpened. "That is my daughter." Ryan didn't move. "I understand, but I have instructions." That was when she realized people were watching. Not with confusion, not with the automatic sympathy she counted on. Guests in the back rows had turned fully now. Caleb's family, my nursing friends, neighbors, people from town. They were not looking at a heartbroken mother shut out by cruel circumstances. They were looking at a woman who had arrived late, uninvited, and furious that the event she tried to stop had gone on without her. Then she noticed the camera. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the wedding videographer standing off to one side near the arbor, still filming the ceremony setup and guest reactions the way wedding videographers do. But the small red record light was unmistakable. My mother froze. It lasted maybe a second, maybe less, but I saw the exact instant her expression changed. The performance left her face before she had the chance to use it. No trembling lower lip, No public heartbreak. No tearful appeal to motherhood. Just calculation, then the cold shock of realizing she was not controlling how this moment would be seen. She looked past Ryan and across the lawn until her eyes found mine. For one suspended breath, we stared at each other through the distance she had spent my entire life trying to close. I had imagined that moment so many different ways over the years. I thought if I ever truly stood against my mother, I would feel rage, triumph, grief big enough to crack me open. Instead, what I felt was something quieter and far more final. Distance. Clean, undeniable distance between who she needed me to remain and who I had become without her permission. Her face hardened. Then she turned, walked back to her car without another word, and drove away in a spray of gravel and dust. The silence she left behind lasted only a beat. Then Tessa's hand pressed lightly at my back. The guitarist picked the melody up without missing the rhythm, and Caleb's eyes stayed locked on mine as if nothing else in the world still mattered. The ceremony had paused, but it had not broken, and neither had I. Once the music started again, everything moved with a kind of quiet clarity, as if the orchard itself had decided my mother had taken enough from us and would not be allowed another second. I took my first step down the aisle, then another, the gravel path steady beneath my shoes, the bouquet warm in my hands from how tightly I had been holding it. The guests turned back toward me. Caleb waited under the arbor with his shoulders squared and his eyes fixed on mine, and the expression on his face was not triumph, not relief exactly, but something deeper. Recognition. Like he could see, in real time, the exact moment I stopped carrying my mother's version of me into the future. By the time I reached him, the trembling in my body had changed shape. It was still there, but no longer from fear. It felt more like release, like something locked for years had finally broken open. Caleb took my hands, and for one impossible second the entire afternoon narrowed to the pressure of his fingers around mine and the sound of the wind moving gently through the trees above us. The officiant, a family friend of Caleb's named Mark, gave us a look that was half question, half blessing. When I nodded, he smiled once and began. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand readings, no performance, no polished script my mother would have approved of. Just vows, sunlight, and the kind of silence that comes when people are witnessing something real enough to make them careful. Caleb went first. His voice was steady until the line about home, and then it roughened just slightly. He said loving me had never felt like rescuing someone or fixing someone. It had felt like recognizing the one person he wanted to build a life beside, board by board, day by day, truth by truth. By the time he finished, Caleb's mother was crying openly in the front row, and my nursing friend Dana was dabbing at her eyes with a folded napkin she had pulled from her purse. Then it was my turn. I had written vows weeks earlier, back when I still thought the biggest challenge ahead of me would be surviving seating charts and cake tastings. Those words no longer fit, so I looked at Caleb and told the truth instead. I choose you, I said, my voice shaking only once. Not because you saved me, but because with you, I finally stopped confusing love with permission. The orchard went very still. I swallowed and kept going. You never asked me to be smaller so you could feel needed. You never used my pain to make me owe you. You just loved me clearly, and that clarity gave me my life back. I don't remember much after that except the way Caleb's thumb brushed once across my knuckles and how the word yes felt in my chest when Mark pronounced us married. The kiss was brief, soft, almost stunned. Then the applause came all at once, rising up across the lawn in a wave so warm and full it made me laugh against Caleb's mouth. The rest of the evening passed in flashes of light and sound and relief, paper plates stacked with barbecue and coleslaw, mason jars sweating sweet tea in people's hands, Caleb's little cousins racing each other between the orchard rows until someone's grandmother threatened to drag them back by their collars, Tessa, finally still for the first time in 2 days, standing near the dessert table with her shoes in one hand and a tired, victorious smile she kept trying to hide. At one point, Caleb's mother pulled me into a hug and said, very quietly, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart. For real." That nearly undid me more than the ceremony had. Late that night, after the last guest had gone and the rental crew had started stacking chairs under the glow of the string lights, Caleb and I sat alone at one of the long wooden tables with the remnants of cake between us and the night settling softly around the orchard. My dress was wrinkled. His tie was in his pocket. Somewhere out past the trees, a cricket kept up its thin, stubborn song. "I should feel different," I said after a while. Caleb looked at me. "Different how?" "I don't know. Finished, maybe." He smiled gently. "Some things don't end in a moment. They just stop owning you." I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about it the next morning, too, sitting at our kitchen table with a sheet of cream stationery in front of me and a pen in my hand. I wrote my mother one letter. Not cruel. Not soft. True. I told her I loved her. I told her what she had done. I told her that love without boundaries had become captivity in her hands, and that if there was ever going to be a door between us again, it would open from my side now. Then I folded the letter, sealed it, and set it by the front door for mailing. My wedding had not given me my mother back. It gave me something she had fought much harder to keep from me. My own life. Here's the real-life lesson this story gives the audience. This story reminds us that not every person who says, "I'm doing this for your own good," is acting out of love. Sometimes control wears the mask of care. Sometimes guilt sounds like concern. And sometimes the people closest to us can confuse loyalty with obedience. The most important lesson is that love without respect, truth, and boundaries stops being love at all. It becomes control. Another powerful takeaway is that healing often begins the moment you stop explaining away someone's harmful behavior. Elena's biggest turning point was not the wedding itself. It was the moment she finally named the truth. Her mother was not just worried. She was sabotaging, manipulating, and trying to keep her dependent. In real life, people often stay trapped much longer because they keep softening the truth to make it easier to bear. But clarity is the beginning of freedom. The story also teaches that boundaries are not cruelty. Saying no, going silent, protecting your plans, or refusing someone access to your life does not make you ungrateful or heartless. It means you are finally taking responsibility for your own peace. Many viewers need to hear this. You are allowed to protect yourself even from family, especially from family, if family is the source of harm. There is also a lesson about support. Elena survived because she did not stand alone. Caleb believed her. Tessa planned ahead. The people around her showed up. In real life, one trustworthy person can change the entire outcome of your story. And if you do not have a Tessa yet, then the lesson is to become your own protector. Document the truth, make a plan, keep evidence, and build a life that cannot be easily destroyed by someone else's instability. Finally, this story teaches that winning does not always look like revenge. Sometimes winning is much quieter. It is keeping your dignity. It is refusing to beg. It is letting truth stand on its own. It is building a life so grounded and honest that manipulation can no longer define you. Elena did not truly win when her mother was shut out of the gate. She won when she stopped needing her mother's permission to live. Final takeaway for the audience: you do not owe anyone access to your life just because they are related to you. Love should feel like safety, not control. And the moment you stop asking permission to be whole may be the moment your real life begins.